Hey, it's Dave Brown here, host of Now with Dave Brown on AMI. Check out this latest highlight from the show. Quebec plans to roll out an app-based vaccine passport system on September 1st that will require people to show a proof of vaccination against COVID-19 to go to bars, restaurants, festivals, or other places where large crowds and close contact is expected. Health Minister Christian Dubé explains the process.
App that will read for the business, the owner of that restaurant will only be able to see if there is a QR code, what is the name, does it match to the license or to la carte d'assurance maladie, and that's it. So there will be no link between a database, or it's only a reading application.
Dubé says the vaccine passport system will help the province keep businesses open and avoid broad lockdowns in case of a fourth wave of COVID-19. I just want to make mention before we jump in here, the federal government also announced a system this week for international travel. That's not what we're discussing here. We're focusing on the conversation on domestic vaccine passports. And since the last time we spoke about this, it was a couple of months ago, vaccine supply has stabilized, vaccine rates have slowed a little bit, and cases have started to tick up again with reopening. So I'm kind of generally curious to get an impression from Michelle and Meagan, who we discussed this with before, whether your thoughts on the notion of a vaccine passport has shifted or changed at all. And Michelle, we'll start with you.
I've thought about this a lot, and I have to say not particularly. I came down ultimately with some reservations on the side of pro-vaccine passport, and ultimately I think I still stand there. I do think it's going to be very interesting to watch Quebec, and I give them some props for being the first out of the gate to do this and almost take a trial run at this on behalf of everyone else in a way. So I'll be interested to see how it actually pans out, but it does seem like the best of a number of flawed options available to us at this point.
Yeah, back when we talked about this in May, I was sort of a little bit ambivalent, and I've since sort of shifted a little bit more towards the pro-vaccine passport concept. And I'll tell you why. Because a lot of businesses have told the government, we want to be able to put in our own vaccination policies, but we need some way to have established proof. So for example, in a province like Manitoba, they're not necessarily mandating vaccine passports like they are in Quebec, but they have created a passport system, or at least a proof of vaccination system that people can use to present to restaurants, bars, etc., gyms who want to put that policy in place. So I've shifted a little bit more towards it purely from the mindset of businesses want to have the ability to use some system and make their own policy. So you need to have a clear way in which for people to share this information if they want to go to these establishments. Meagan, as I recall, let's ask the question sort of more openly.
Sure.
Have you shifted at all a little bit in your thoughts on the vaccine passports?
Sure. I know in the past I've brought up concerns that other people have about how vaccine passports interact with individuals' rights. I still have those concerns. I think as I listen to conversations about vaccine passports and sometimes engage in conversations with vaccine passports, what I'm observing more is what we just said in the past few months, how little has changed for some people. And without getting to all the details of my personal life during the pandemic, I have the privilege of having friends who are very much on both sides of this, and then I always try to play Switzerland in conversation, which is fun. And what I find is that people who have concerns about this, I don't feel like their concerns have been addressed. Like, I don't know if people are even trying to understand where other people in their lives are coming from, or even engaging in really what their concerns are, and then people are just stuck in the same spot that they've always been.
Yeah, I see where you're coming from, Meagan, but other than people screaming about personal freedom, I'm not really hearing a coherent case against vaccine passports.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm in the same boat. And I have to say that I suspect all of us here share your concerns, Meagan, about privacy and whatnot. Those remain, and those will have to be addressed. And that's where Quebec, I think, can really start to pave the way by giving us a sense of how it will look. We've seen a number of international models, but nothing at play here yet. We haven't even necessarily heard from the Canadian privacy commissioners on how it ought to look, and they did weigh in, and they did help shape things like
very broadly. They weighed in. That's how we started this conversation a few months ago with their very broad statements.
Sure, but think back on the COVID tracing app that was rolled out last summer, right? That was designed and developed based largely on their specs. And after that happened, the app didn't get the uptake that people were hoping for, but the privacy concerns were largely put to bed because of the way it was handled. So there does have to be a way to move it forward, and I think I think that your concern, Megan, is a driving force for a lot of people because it is a real concern.
Yeah, and it's one that I think can really make for some interesting conversations for sure. I had a few last weekend, especially with a few of my legal friends, talking about freedom and what freedoms we do give up as being part of a civil society, generally speaking. It is interesting, right? Like you have the right to drink, you don't have the right to drink and drive, right? There's all kinds of things that
or drink in public,
or sometimes it depends.
Well, you know what I
yeah.
mean.
Anyway, but let's not get too dwelled and locked into that. Let's actually try to deal with one of the other complex issues of this, because we have talked about it. It is a small number, but there are certain individuals who will not be able to take the vaccine, who are going to be looking for exemptions for medical reasons that preclude them from receiving the vaccine. So I know this question's kind of big and broad, so I don't think we should dwell too long here. But Michelle, how stringent but also transparent should the process for seeking an exemption be?
I'm more, if I had to choose between one, I would push for transparency over stringency, because those reasons are very complex and deeply personal. And if we're talking about privacy, that's going to be a real intersection. Health data, you shouldn't have to necessarily bring your whole medical file to get an exemption, but you do need to have a clear process spelled out.
The exemption should be done at the provincial ministry health level, not by the bouncer at Ye Old Orchard on de la Montagne at 11 o'clock on a Saturday night.
Amen.
Megan, when it comes to that exemption process, because again, I know there are people, like that's an important part of this conversation, how stringent but also transparent should this policy, should this part of the policy be?
Yeah, but what you both said, there needs to be a lot of transparency, and it needs to be clearly defined who is allowed to give that exemption and why.
And what's required.
Those people are allowed to give exemptions and not me, for example. I have no medical training. And they just clearly laid out and understandable for the general public and consistency across the board for the practitioners who would be giving out those exemptions.
Yeah, like you can't be going to Popeye's supplements to buy your protein powder and also get in a COVID exemption, COVID passport exemption as well. So I do have some other discrimination concerns, but maybe not in the way that a lot of our legal friends might be thinking about from more broad-minded Rousseau concepts of people living in a civil society. This QR code needs to be printed on paper or displayed on a cell phone. How do we ensure that populations without internet access can get this code printed, or who don't have a cell phone can get this code? I've got this idea of kind of saying, in the same way that we've had pop-up clinics, we should have pop-up verification centers where someone can get a code printed for them and maybe even plasticized and put in kind of like a nice little safe thing you can stick into your wallet. But Michelle, what do you think about the idea of trying to ensure, I'm thinking especially people who are experiencing homelessness, right? It's like who may not have a phone, may not have a printer, but who do need to go into Tim Hortons now from time to time to get a coffee.
Absolutely. I wish I could argue from the Cartesian perspective to offer some balance for your Rousseau approach. However, that is a concern, and I do think that there's room to have some partnerships. We've talked before about libraries having a role to play, or the role that libraries have assumed with the homeless population, for instance. Perhaps some kind of partnership could be arranged there for some of those pop-up clinic sites. I do think you should be able to visit Service Ontario or its equivalents in other provinces to get your QR code printed off for you or issued, if that's something you needed to be able to do, because most communities do have them at some place now. In more remote areas, you should be able to get it requested by mail through the ministry, I would say.
That's a great idea.
That's great.
Yeah, it's basic, it's simple, but some people still like it that way. So I do think the government would need to be actively involved in ensuring equitable distribution.
Megan, what do you make of the idea of ensuring that people who may not have access to internet or other tools like a printer are going to be able to get access to this? I love Michelle's mail idea. That's awesome.
I do. I love both these ideas. This has been a concern I've been thinking about this whole time. We're talking about vaccine passports, and then it gets reinforced every time I have to go somewhere and they're like, pull out your phone for as proof as your ticket, and I think I have a phone. What about everybody who doesn't have one? So I only reached as far as I was like, it needs to be a physical. There needs to be a physical copy that you can hand somebody, like a driver's license type size. You put it in your wallet or in your pocket if you have one. So I like your thought of having pop-up clinics to make sure people get verification, or incorporating that into the vaccine clinic, that you can just do both at the same stop. I just have, I think more just because of different reporting I've done. Okay, what about when we do vaccine clinics for individuals who are living in long-term care homes or different congregate living situations? How do we just make sure that everybody has their own, and that they know where it is, and that they know what it is, and that it's easily accessible for them?
Yeah, that's a great, there's certainly an accessibility side of this as well that can get lost in sort of just that digital picture, right? And certainly for individuals, like you said, living in long-term care, other congregate livings, definitely an important consideration as well. Guys, I'm glad we kind of covered that base, because I do think that's a really important one. Let's be clear, Quebec wants this to roll out in 18 days from now. You know, like they need to have their plan in place to get this into people's hands, especially those who might be more marginalized, who can't get this thing on one simple download. So they need to have a plan in place like today for this.
They do, and they haven't disclosed it yet. They keep saying details to come, details to come. So I think there's a bit of a scramble underway, perhaps, to get some of those logistics lined up.
No doubt. So Italy just launched a similar system this past week, in fact, and they've already had cases of fraud crop up. I'm going to make you guys put on your judge, jury, and executioner cap on this one. Meagan, how strong should the penalty be for distributing fake vaccine passports? Not necessarily carrying one. I don't want to get into a war on drugs situation, but for actually distributing, creating fakes, frauds, etc.
Okay, well, not as strong as execution. I don't want to go that far in my rules.
Let's not reinstitute the death penalty.
But I'm not sure. I've been trying to do some research on this, on what is out there already that exists, and are penalties if you've been found fraudulently producing other government documents.
Fake IDs, driver's licenses, passports,
fake driver's licenses, that types of thing. So I would say that we already do have a framework in place. Use that as some of your guideposts and work with what you have, instead of just coming up with something new.
That's a perfect answer. Why redraw legislation when you already have a framework in place? That's why we keep Meagan on here, because she's super smart like that. And Michelle, any follow-up on that?
And highly practical. That said, I would personally argue for penalties at the stiffer end of said framework in a case like this, because this is not just basic fraud. It's not the equivalent of fraud under 5,000 if we're putting it in financial terms. This is closer. This is more akin to fraud over, in my estimation, because it's compromising public health.
Guys, I was going to ask this question about, Quebec's going to be the first province through the door on this. How closely will other provinces be watching? But I think we can all accept that, everybody is going to be watching this closely with Quebec going first. But I do want to finish with sort of a big binary question here. And it's something we did explore in our daily poll earlier in the week, our very scientific daily poll earlier in the week on social media. If you had to choose, Meagan, new public health restrictions due to a surge or a vaccine passport, what's your pick?
I have been flip-flopping on this for the past day and a half. When you first posed that twist. So I still have not landed. I will say this. I think whatever is decided, there needs to be a lot of transparency about how these decisions were made, why they were made, and there needs to be clear parameters. So how long are you going to let this go for? Whatever you decide, how long would you let new health restrictions, whatever they are, and I argue they should maybe be a little different than they've been in the past. How long are you going to let that go for? How long is a vaccine passport going to be part of our lives? I think people need clear information about this.
Yeah, that's fair. For what it's worth, this binary question is what started to nudge me a little bit closer towards the concept of a vaccine passport. I think there are a lot of people who did what was asked of them in regards to being able to do these reopening policies, because so many Canadian provincial reopening policies were tied to vaccine numbers that I do really believe that the vaccine passport would be my choice. But there's also a clear bias there. I'm double vaccinated. I like going to movies. I like going to bars. I like going to restaurants. So I would like to keep being able to do that if I can. But Michelle, when I pose that binary to you, where do you land?
I am I've been ambivalent on this one as well. For me, the issue boils down to adherence, because we saw increasingly that people were willing to stop following lockdown rules and not heed that public advice. I suspect people are more likely to adhere to a vaccine passport system if one were to be implemented. And we all know that there are swaths of the economy that just straight up can't withstand another shutdown like what we've had. So at the end of the day, even though I personally took a certain amount of comfort in some of the lockdowns and wouldn't hate it terribly or as much as you might expect if they came back, I'd probably fall on the side of a vaccine passport if I had to choose.
Guys,
but maybe there's room for both.
Well, you know, that was also a very popular vote because I gave people that option in the social media poll, and both definitely came up as well. 0% voted for new public health restrictions, by the way, on that very scientific poll that we do, although our sample size would be questionable. Guys, thank you for revisiting this topic with me. I know we talked about it before, but I think now that we had sort of a real concrete news hook to chew into, I think we were able to sort of further that conversation a bit further. So thank you guys on that front. Do you want to dive into more conversations like this? Watch Now with Dave Brown weekdays at 9 a.m. Eastern on AMI TV or download the podcasts wherever you listen. Do you want to dive into more conversations like this? Watch Now with Dave Brown weekdays at 9 a.m. Eastern on AMI TV or download the podcasts wherever you listen.